Hello there, welcome to the channel and welcome back if you're a return viewer. I'm Kerry and welcome to the Christchurch Review of Books. Now it's been 3 or 4 weeks since I've put out a video. Unfortunately, real life kind of impinged on my free time. I actually started a new job. It's in insurance again, and the commute and the work and the general lack of energy and lack of time after I've finished doing all that kind of has put a bit of a crimp on my video producing abilities. It's a public holiday here today in New Zealand, so it is King's birthday. First time during my lifetime that has been called that. It's usually Queen's birthday and it's changed for obvious reasons. So anyway, today a book that I finished about 3 weeks ago and have been meaning to do a review of ever since. It is Love and Let Die by John Higgs. Now this is a very fascinating book. The author John Higgs usually writes a lot about popular culture, history, high art, and the kind of combination of all of them. He's written books on things like the band the KLF, he's written books on Watling Street, an ancient street that still you can follow in the UK, a lot of stuff about the 20th century, all sorts of stuff, and artists and creators and all that type of thing. So when he put a new book out, and it was about the Beatles and James Bond, somehow combining them, I pre-ordered it on site, and there it goes. So Love and Let Die by John Higgs. Now this book kind of contrasts and compares the Beatles' cultural impact and that of James Bond, the character, the super spy, what have you, in books and the movies. Now, the introduction is really great. It takes place on a day in October, I think it's the 5th of October 1961, which was notable because it's the day the first Beatles single came out, and at the very same time the first James Bond movie, Dr. No, started screening at UK cinemas. And from then on we launch into like a background of both parts of this thesis, the history of the various members of the Beatles. Some of them are quite eventful childhoods. I'd never kind of realised how eventful their lives were before they even became the Beatles. And also we have a history of the creator of James Bond, Ian Fleming, who is a bit of a frustrated action hero who always wanted to be up front and during conflicts and espionage, always seemed to be sitting out in the back rooms, and hence came James Bond, his kind of alter ego, wish fulfillment, fantasy type thing. Now, the main thesis of this book, which Higgs kind of hangs the whole thing on from there on in, is that the Beatles kind of represent the ordinary UK citizen. They came from the streets, basically, the lower classes. And their broader message was that of love in a kind of general sense towards the other man, towards other people, peace and love, that type of thing that would become prominent later in the 1960s. Whereas James Bond is kind of a representative of a certain part of the UK establishment, the upper class, proper, colonial, that type of thing. And Bond's main feature is that he deals in death. And the death of others, the death of enemies of the state, the death of even women he has relationships with. Everywhere he goes, Bond brings death or attracts death. Now, most of the book is kind of hung on this thesis, and we go through the history of the Beatles, which is really actually interesting. It's really well researched. Higgs has got the benefit of a whole lot of books about the Beatles haven't been written in the last few decades. I'd never really dived into a detailed history of the Fab Four myself, so it was really interesting reading some of the things, and he goes off on tangents about the various people who are associated with the Beatles themselves and brought about change in the band, and how the Beatles really became one of those bands which was one of those cultural influences which is kind of mentioned in the same sentence as things like Shakespeare now when Britain tries to promote itself. It's the home of the Beatles and Shakespeare and what have you. Such a cultural impact they've had. Now, I was kind of like a fan of the Beatles growing up. My sister was a big fan of them, and she played a lot of their music, and I listened to it, and I've become a fan later on in life. I've never been a mad fanatic. I've never read a lot of the books on them, so like I said, this book is interesting. If nothing else, it's a concise and incisive history of the Beatles contained within this book, and as part of this thesis of Higgs's. Now, Bond, we learn all about the backstories of the books and Fleming's various peccadillos and strange tastes. Fleming himself comes to an untimely end. He doesn't live a particularly healthy life. He kind of squirrels himself away into his house in Jamaica and writes a book a year and lives a bon vivant life. So we follow the Bond movies as well as the books and the various characters and actors and behind the scene type of stuff. So the Bond stuff kind of recedes into the background a bit in this book. The Beatles story kind of takes over for many chapters. Bond kind of can't compete with the real life goings on, really. There's also a lot of discussion of the place that these two cultural influences have in the British psyche, and there's a lot of discussion on masculinity and what it means to be a man and during those days, and how this was changing in the 60s and so on. It's very interesting, and I was surprised that halfway through the book we come to the breakup of the Beatles and the death of Ian Fleming. So where can the book go from there? It actually gets more fascinating. We follow the kind of the solo careers of the Beatles and the infighting and the barbs they were throwing at each other after the end of the Beatles, and John Lennon kind of turned against everyone else and became a bit of a jerk, really. The Bond movies after in the late 60s, early 70s and towards the 80s, whatever, how they kind of went downhill and had to be rescued by various different teams. The various actors they replaced Sean Connery with, and Roger Moore and so on. The Bond stuff really doesn't kind of interest me as much as the Beatles for some reason. I'm not sure. It's not written as deeply or as broadly as the Beatles coverage in this book. Get a feeling that the author doesn't really like the Bond stuff quite as much as the Beatles, which is probably pretty obvious. He doesn't think a lot of Ian Fleming at all, and but however he doesn't think a lot of John Lennon in the late period Beatles either. He kind of sees him as a bit of a jerk. Although there's a very sympathetic chapter covering the death of John Lennon in 1980, of course, when he was murdered. The later section of the book follows the careers of George Harrison and John Lennon until their deaths, and some surprising stuff in there as well. A lot of these, the Beatles were portrayed as hating each other after the breakup, but there's a lot of collaboration and stuff going on still, which is interesting. And we also follow Paul McCartney to the present day, and Harry's basically become the winner out of all of them. And yeah, so that is the book. It's really interesting. We end up with the latest Bond movie, No Time to Die, and what it means. I won't spoil it here, but a certain thing happens at the end of that movie, and it kind of feeds into Higgs's thesis and what it means for all of us. The Beatles, obviously cultural influence, massive, and how they changed things, how they set the template for bands of today, and everything that followed. So the book is fascinating. Like I said, there's loads of little tangents. It goes off into things that you weren't expecting, how things were connected to the Beatles or Bond, or influenced by the Beatles or Bond. There's a lot of the Bond imitation movies and books, all that type of thing. So I really found it fascinating, and it got me back into listening to Beatles music on various streaming services and my own collection. Discovered a couple of new albums that I didn't know, like the Beatles. You have new mail. Oh, there goes the email. The Beatles Love album from the early 2000s, where they remixed and mashed up a lot of things. It's quite a wonderful listen to if you listen to the whole album through. That's a little advert. So that's it. Love and Let Die by John Higgs. Worth a read if you're at all interested in the Beatles, James Bond, or the UK culture. Go and have a read of this book. Okay, so that is me for today. We'll be back soon with a book haul. I've got quite a pile of books that I've acquired since early May when I did the last one, so we'll be back with that very soon.